They laughed when the forgotten girl from Ash Hollow was dragged to the altar to marry a ruined alpha. They said he was crippled, useless, a king in name only, hidden away because he could no longer stand on his own 2 feet. They said she was nothing, an orphan with no pack, no title, no worth. But on the night of the first full moon, she heard something behind the locked doors of the western tower, a roar that did not belong to any broken man, a roar that belonged to a beast the kingdom had spent 5 years pretending did not exist. And when she opened that door, she did not find a crippled king. She found the most powerful, most terrifying alpha alive, and the moment his golden eyes locked onto hers, she understood, with a certainty that shook her to her bones, that she was the only person left in the world who could save him or die trying. Welcome back to Rena Romance 2, where the stories are slow burn, the alphas are dangerous, and the love is worth every scar. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe because tonight's story is one of our darkest, most emotional tales yet. Get comfortable. This one runs long, and it earns every minute. The village of Ash Hollow smelled like wood smoke and old rain, and Alora Vane had lived there for 19 years without once being asked what she wanted. She scrubbed floors for coin. She mended nets for the fishing families who wouldn't look her in the eye. She slept in a loft above a tannery that reeked of lye and hide. And when the other Omegas of the village whispered about mates and meetings, and the sweetness of finding the one your wolf howled for, Alora said nothing because her wolf did not howl. Her wolf had gone quiet the day her family left her on the steps of a stranger's house and never came back. She did not remember their faces anymore. She remembered only the cold of that morning, and the way no one in Ash Hollow had ever quite trusted a girl who arrived like a piece of driftwood, unclaimed and unexplained. Cursed, some of them murmured when they thought she couldn't hear. No pack would leave behind a child unless something was wrong with her. She had grown up believing them. She was scrubbing the tannery floor on the morning the royal riders came. 3 black horses cutting through the fog with banners of silver and midnight blue snapping behind them. The sigil of the Duskmoor pack, rulers of the northern territories. A house so powerful and so feared that even saying their name in Ash Hollow made old women reach for iron charms. Alora straightened, hands raw and cracking, and watched the riders stop in the village square. She should have gone back to her scrubbing. Instead, some old instinct, the same one that had kept her alive and alone for 19 years, told her to stay very, very still. By decree of the Crown Council, the lead rider announced, unrolling a scroll heavy with wax seals, a bride has been chosen for His Grace, Alpha Ronan Duskmoor, King of the Northern Wolves, to be wed within the fortnight, that the bloodline of Duskmoor may continue, and the throne remain secure. A ripple of murmurs went through the square. Every unmated girl in Ash Hollow held her breath, half in hope, half in terror. Marrying the Duskmoor Alpha meant becoming Queen of the North. It also meant marrying the king no one had seen in 5 years. The king who was whispered to be broken, crippled, hollowed out by some injury or curse he refused to explain, ruling from behind closed doors while his generals did the actual governing. The bride, the rider continued, has been selected not by beauty or rank, but by the old blood-marking ritual performed at birth in every registered pack household. The mark has been found. He turned, and to Alora's horror, his eyes swept the crowd and settled directly on her. Alora Vane, step forward. The square went silent enough to hear her own heartbeat. She not move at first because surely, this was a mistake, a cruel joke, the kind of thing the village boys sometimes did to humiliate her further. But the rider dismounted, crossed the square, and took her wrist in his gloved hand, turning it over to reveal the pale, crescent-shaped birthmark she'd carried since infancy and had always been told meant nothing. The mark of the moonbound, he said quietly, almost reverently. You are to be queen. Laughter broke out, sharp, disbelieving, cruel. Her? The tannery girl? The one nobody claimed? Alora felt her face burn, but beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. A tiny, treacherous flicker of hope, the kind she'd spent years trying to smother, because hope had only ever led her to more disappointment. Maybe, it whispered, you were never worthless. Maybe you were simply waiting. The journey to Duskmore Castle took 4 days, and Alora spent every hour of it being quietly, thoroughly informed by the palace attendants exactly how little she was wanted. He hasn't taken a single visitor in 5 years, one maid whispered to another, not caring if Alora heard. Not since the accident. They say his own legs don't work right anymore. They say his wolf is gone. Then why marry at all? Politics. The council needs an heir before the rival packs start circling. They'd have married him to a broom if the mark had shown up on one. Alora stared out the carriage window at the black pines rolling past and said nothing, though the words settled into her chest like stones. She had spent her whole life being told she was unworthy of love. Apparently, the universe had decided to pair her with a man equally convinced he was unworthy of it too, except his conviction came wrapped in a crown. Duskmore Castle rose out of the mountains like something carved from midnight itself. Black stone, silver-veined windows, banners snapping in wind that smelled of pine and distant snow. And waiting at the gates, in a line of nobles dressed richer than anything Alora had ever touched, stood a young man in a wheeled chair. His dark hair falling over eyes so tired they looked centuries old. Alpha Ronan Duskmore, even diminished, even seated, there was something in the set of his jaw, the coiled stillness of his shoulders, that made every instinct in Alora's body go quiet and alert at once. The way a rabbit goes still when it senses, without knowing why, that a wolf is near. He did not smile. He did not rise because, she would learn later, he could not. Not on nights near the full moon, when the curse gripped his bones and left him weak enough to need a chair by morning. He simply looked at her, up and down, with an expression of such total indifference that it was almost worse than cruelty. "This is her?" he said to his steward, not to Alora. "The tannery girl? The mark was confirmed, Your Grace." "Fine." His voice was flat, exhausted. "Marry us. Get the paperwork done. I have no interest in pretending this is anything but what it is." The nobles laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly enough to be punished for it, but enough that Alora heard every syllable. A broken king and a nameless girl. What a match. She lifted her chin. 19 years of being underestimated had at least taught her one skill: how to keep her spine straight while the whole world tried to bend her. "Then let's get the paperwork done," she said quietly, and had the small, bitter satisfaction of seeing surprise flicker across Ronan's tired eyes before he looked away. If you're already feeling for Alora, drop a comment right now and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated by everyone around you? Rihanna Romance 2 reads every single comment. And this story only gets more emotional from here. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss where this goes. The first week at Duskmore Castle taught Alora more about loneliness than 19 years in Ash Hollow ever had, and that was saying something. At least in the village, the cruelty had been familiar. The same whispered insults, the same averted eyes, worn smooth by repetition until she barely felt them anymore. Here, the cruelty was colder, dressed in silk and good manners, delivered with smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. "Her Grace requires new gowns," she overheard one noblewoman murmur to another, not bothering to lower her voice as Alora passed. "Though I suppose Her Grace is a generous term for a girl who smells like a tannery." "Give it time," the other replied. "The king will have the marriage quietly dissolved once the council stops watching so closely. No one actually expects it to last." Alora ate her meals alone after that, in the small servants' alcove off the kitchen, because at least the cooks, gruff, overworked, and too busy to bother with cruelty, treated her like a person rather than a joke. It was there, on the fourth night, that she first saw a flicker of something different in Ronan Duskmore. He came down to the kitchens himself, late, well past midnight, wheeled by no one, pushing his own chair through the narrow servant corridors, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd clearly done this many times before when he thought no one important was watching. He stopped short at the sight of her sitting alone at the small wooden table, a bowl of cold stew in front of her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You eat here," he said finally, not a question. "The dining hall has a better view of people staring at me," Alora said. "I find I prefer the cold stew." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile but close enough that she noticed. He wheeled himself to the table, and after a long, awkward silence, gestured at the pot still simmering over the low fire. "Is there more?" She served him without a word, and they ate together in silence that was, for the first time since her arrival, not entirely uncomfortable. He didn't apologize for the court's cruelty. He didn't pretend to be kind, but he stayed long after the fire burned low. And when he finally wheeled himself back toward his chambers, he paused at the doorway. "For what it's worth," he said, not quite looking at her, "I don't think you smell like a tannery." It was such a small thing. It should not have made her chest ache the way it did. The wedding was small, cold, and utterly without ceremony. Alora wore a gown 2 sizes too large, borrowed from a noble woman who made sure to mention it had been altered from a discarded wardrobe. Ronan said his vows from his wheelchair, his voice hollow, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder the entire time. When the ceremony ended, he was wheeled away by 2 silent guards before Alora even had the chance to speak to him. She was given a chamber in the eastern wing, beautiful, cold, and entirely isolated from the rest of the castle. No one visited. No one explained anything. She learned the rules of Duskmore Castle, the way she'd learned everything else in her life, by watching and by being ignored enough to see what others assumed she couldn't understand. She learned that the western tower was locked every single night. She'd learned that the guards who stood watch outside it changed shifts nervously, refusing to meet each other's eyes. She learned that every full moon, servants vanished from the castle halls entirely, retreating to the lower cellars until dawn, and that anyone caught near the western tower after dark was dismissed from service without explanation, or according to one particularly frightened maid, simply never seen again. "Don't ask about the tower," the maid warned her, refusing to make eye contact. "Don't ask about what happened 5 years ago, and whatever you do, my lady, never ever go near it on a full moon." "Why not?" The maid's hands trembled around her tray. "Because his grace isn't crippled," she whispered. "He's cursed, and on a full moon, he isn't a man at all." Alora lay awake that night, turning the words over and over. He isn't crippled. He's cursed. It explained so much. The wheelchair, that seemed to depend on the calendar more than any injury should. The guard's fear. The way the whole castle held its breath every 28 days. She thought of her own mark, the crescent moon on her wrist that the royal rider had called moonbound. She thought of how her wolf had gone silent the day she was abandoned, and how, for the first time in 19 years, sitting alone in a castle that did not want her, she felt it stir. Faint, curious, awake, as though something in this place was calling to a part of her she'd never been allowed to know. The full moon came 11 days after the wedding. Alora felt it before she understood it. A restlessness under her skin, a pull toward the western tower so strong it felt like a hand closing around her ribs and tugging. The castle emptied early that night. Servants disappeared to the cellars. Guards abandoned their usual posts near her chambers, leaving the halls eerily silent. She should have stayed in her room. Every warning she'd been given told her to stay in her room. Instead, she found herself walking the cold stone corridors toward the one door in the entire castle she'd been forbidden to approach, her bare feet silent on the flagstones. her heart hammering with something that wasn't quite fear. The tower door was ajar. That alone told her something was wrong. The door that was supposedly guarded and locked every night of every month stood open, as though whatever kept it shut had failed. And from inside, echoing down the spiral stairs, came a sound that turned her blood to ice. A roar, deep, guttural, agonized. The sound of something enormous in unbearable pain. Every instinct told her to run. She climbed the stairs instead. What she found at the top defied everything she'd been told. Ronan Duskmore was not in his wheeled chair. He was on his knees in the center of a stone chamber, scored with claw marks decades deep. His body racked with violent tremors, his spine arching at an angle no human spine should bend. Silver light poured through the tower's high windows, and where it touched his skin, black fur rippled and receded like something fighting a war beneath the surface. "Get out!" he snarled, and his voice was wrong. Layered, doubled, a man's voice tangled with something far older and far more dangerous. "Get out now!" She should have obeyed. Every fiber of survival instinct she owned told her to obey. Instead, Alora took a step closer. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and was startled to realize it was true. His head snapped up, and the eyes that met hers were no longer human. Molten gold, slit-pupilled, burning with an agony so deep it made her chest ache in sympathy. For one suspended moment, beast and man stared at the girl who had walked willingly into the one room the entire castle was terrified of, and something in that golden gaze shifted from rage to something raw. Recognition. "Mate?" The voice inside him seemed to breathe, though his human mouth never moved. Moonbound, and then the transformation tore through him fully. And Ronan Duskmore, Alpha King of the North, feared and pitied in equal measure, became for the first time in front of another living soul in 5 long years, exactly what the rumors had always said he was. A beast. The Lycan that emerged from Ronan's collapsing human form was nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, black as the space between stars, its claws long enough to open stone. Every survival instinct Alora possessed screamed at her to flee. She stayed exactly where she was, hands trembling at her sides, and did the only thing that felt true in that moment. She spoke to him, not to the beast, but to the man buried somewhere beneath it. "I know you're in there," she said softly. "I know you're afraid of what you'll do. I'm not leaving." The Lycan's massive head lowered toward her, hot breath washing over her face, and for one heartbeat that stretched into eternity, Alora genuinely believed she would not survive the next second. Instead, the creature pressed its enormous trembling head against her chest and let out a sound that was not a roar at all. It was a whimper. The sound of something that had been alone and in pain for 5 years, finally allowing itself for one single night not to be. She wrapped her arms around as much of that massive neck as she could reach and stayed there until dawn, until the silver light faded from the windows and the transformation reversed itself in agonized shuddering waves, until Ronan Duskmore, human, exhausted, and utterly stripped of every wall he'd spent 5 years building, lay in her arms on the cold tower floor, breathing hard, staring up at her like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at without pity or fear. "You should hate me," he rasped. "Everyone who's ever seen what I become has hated me." "I don't hate you," Alora said, and meant it with a certainty that startled her. "I think I was born to find you." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Duskmore Castle, she watched something in his exhausted face loosen. Not healed, not fixed, but no longer entirely alone. The moon goddess, it seemed, had known exactly what she was doing when she carved a crescent mark into the wrist of an abandoned girl in a forgotten mountain village. If this story is pulling at your heart the way it pulled at mine when I first read it, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it tells me you want more stories exactly like this one. Now, let's find out just how deep this curse really runs. In the weeks that followed, Ronan told her everything, haltingly, at first, like a man unused to being believed. 5 years earlier at his coronation, a rival alpha named Malric Ironclaw had orchestrated an ambush disguised as a diplomatic visit. Ronan had survived the assassination attempt, but not without cost. A cursed blade, forged by a rogue witch in Ironclaw's service, had pierced him during the fight, binding an ancient and malevolent Lycan spirit to his bloodline. Every full moon since, the spirit clawed for control, and every full moon, Ronan's own wolf grew weaker fighting it back. "The physician said I'd lose myself within a year," he admitted one evening in the castle's private study, firelight flickering against the scars along his forearms. "It's been 5. I don't know how much longer I can hold him back." "Then we find a way to break it," Alora said simply, as though it were the most obvious solution in the world. "You say that like it's easy." "I say that like it's necessary." She met his eyes that had softened toward her in ways neither of them fully understood yet, though the whole castle was beginning to whisper about the change in their king. "I didn't survive 19 years of being told I was worthless, just to watch you give up." It was around this time that the old castle historian, a nervous ink-stained man named Corvin, came to Alora privately with a discovery that would upend everything she thought she knew about herself. "My lady," he said, hands shaking as he unrolled an ancient genealogical chart, "the mark on your wrist isn't a random blessing, it's a bloodline marker. You're descended from the Silvermoon lineage, the last line of lunar priestesses, thought extinct for 3 centuries. Only a Silvermoon bloodline can perform the ritual required to break a Lycan spirit binding." Alora stared at the chart, at names stretching back generations, at a lineage she'd never known she belonged to, torn away from her the moment her family abandoned her on a stranger's doorstep. "Why would my family give me up?" she whispered, "if I was this important?" Corvin's expression turned grim. "Perhaps, my lady, because someone wanted you gone before you could ever discover what you were." The truth came out in pieces, each one more painful than the last. Alora's family had not abandoned her out of shame, as she'd believed her entire life. They had been forced to flee an attack by Ironclaw agents seeking to eliminate the last Silvermoon bloodline before it could ever threaten Malric Ironclaw's ambitions. In the chaos, her parents had hidden her in Ash Hollow, intending to return. They never got the chance. Ironclaw's forces found them within the year. Alora absorbed this history in silence, sitting beside Ronan in the castle gardens, the crescent mark on her wrist suddenly feeling less like a curse and more like the last surviving piece of a family who had loved her enough to die protecting her secret. "I spent my whole life thinking no one wanted me," she said quietly, "and they died, trying to keep me safe." Ronan took her hand carefully, like a man still learning he was allowed to. "Then, let's make sure it wasn't for nothing. The war, when it came, arrived exactly as Ironclaw intended, swiftly and from within. A trusted general of the Duskmoor court, secretly in Ironclaw's pay for years, attempted to poison Ronan during a full moon, hoping the curse would finish what the blade could not. Alora caught the betrayal only because her Silvermoon senses, newly awakening, instinctive and half understood, flared with a warning she couldn't explain until she saw the general's hands trembling around the wine decanter. The general was captured. Under interrogation, he revealed Ironclaw's full plan. A coordinated assault timed for the next blood moon, when Ironclaw's own Dark Alliance believed the curse would finally consume Ronan entirely, leaving Duskmoor's territories undefended and ripe for conquest. "Then we have until the blood moon," Ronan said grimly, "to either break this curse or lose everything." Alora squeezed his hand. "Then we don't waste a single day. Quick favor before we continue. If you haven't already, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. Reina Romance 2, posts new full-length stories regularly, and trust me, you don't want to miss the ending of this one. Now, back to Duskmoor Castle, where the blood moon is closing in fast. If the nobles of Duskmoor Castle had been slow to warm to Alora, the king's own family had been slower still, and none more than his younger sister, General Isolde Duskmoor, commander of the Black Pine Guard, and the fiercest wolf in the north after her brother himself. Isolde had watched 3 separate suitors attempt to use Ronan's condition for their own political advancement over the years, and she had come to trust exactly no one who arrived at Duskmoor Castle with a marriage contract in hand. She made her suspicion of Alora plain from the very first week. "You'll forgive me," Isolde said coolly, finding Alora practicing sword forms alone in the training yard at dawn. A habit Alora had kept from the rare, precious hours a retired soldier in Ash Hollow had once spent teaching a friendless orphan girl how to defend herself. "But I've watched my brother be used by people who claim to care about him before. I intend to watch you very closely." "Good," Alora said, without breaking her stance. "I'd think less of you if you didn't." Isolde blinked, clearly having expected either fear or false charm, and receiving neither. "Where did a tannery girl learn to hold a blade like that?" "The same place I learned everything useful in my life. Nobody thought I was worth teaching, so I found people who didn't care what anyone thought, and asked them anyway." Something shifted in Isolde's expression. Not trust, not yet, but the first flicker of respect. She drew her own blade. "Again," she said. "Properly this time. Your footing's sloppy." They trained together most mornings after that, and though Isolde remained sharp-tongued and slow to soften, Alora came to understand that beneath the general suspicion was a woman who had spent 5 years quietly grieving the brother she'd watched suffer in isolation, terrified of losing him to a curse none of them could break. When Isolde finally witnessed firsthand the moment Alora walked into the western tower during a full moon without flinching, something in the general's guarded heart cracked open at last. "He hasn't let anyone that close since the accident," Isolde admitted quietly, watching from the tower stairs as Alora calmed her transformed brother with nothing but steady hands and a voice that refused to waver. "Not me. Not our own mother before she passed. Just you." "He didn't let me close," Alora said. "I didn't give him a choice." Isolde huffed something that might, in a woman less guarded, have been called a laugh. "Moon Goddess, help us both. I think I actually like you." It was not a declaration of love or even friendship. Not quite yet. But it was, Alora understood, the first stone laid toward something she had never once had in her 19 years of life. A family who chose her not because blood or duty demanded it, but because she had earned it, one hard-won moment at a time. Not every threat to Alora's place at Duskmoor Castle wore iron-claw colors. Lady Seraphine Voss was the daughter of one of the North's oldest noble houses, raised from birth on the quiet, unspoken understanding that she would one day be queen. She had courted Ronan for 2 years before the council's blood-marking ritual overturned every plan she'd ever made, and she had spent every day since Alora's arrival smiling sweetly while searching for a crack in the marriage she could widen into a full collapse. "You must be exhausted," Seraphina said one afternoon, finding Alora alone in the castle library, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Pretending to belong somewhere you clearly don't. It's such heavy work, isn't it? I only mention it because I'd hate to see you humiliate yourself further than you already have." "I appreciate your concern," Alora replied evenly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Though I notice you've had 2 years to become queen, and somehow still aren't." Seraphina's smile thinned. The council could still annul a marriage that fails to produce results, especially if certain embarrassing truths about the king's condition became public beyond these walls. I wonder how the Alpha would feel, knowing his new bride couldn't even keep his secret. The threat was unmistakable. Alora's blood ran cold. Not for herself, but for what exposure of Ronan's curse would mean for the entire kingdom. for the rival packs already circling like vultures. She said nothing to Ronan at first, not wanting to burden him with one more danger while he was already fighting the curse itself. It was a mistake born of the same old instinct that had kept her silent and small her entire life. The belief that her problems were hers alone to carry. It took Serafina attempting to slip a sealed letter to a council messenger. A letter Alora intercepted only by chance, catching sight of the wax seal bearing details of the curse she'd never told anyone outside the castle. For the truth to finally come out. Confronted in front of the full court, Serafina's carefully cultivated composure shattered into open venom. "She doesn't deserve any of this," Serafina spat, no longer bothering with pleasantries. "A tannery girl with a lucky birthmark stumbling into a crown the rest of us spent our whole lives preparing for. I would have been a better queen in every way that matters." "Perhaps," Ronan said quietly, stepping forward with a coldness in his voice the court had rarely heard, directed at anyone but enemies on a battlefield. "You would have been a queen who threatened to expose my family's darkest secret for personal advancement. Alora has bled for this kingdom. You tried to sell it." He turned to his guards. "Lady Voss is no longer welcome within these walls." As Serafine was escorted from the castle in disgraced silence, Alora felt something shift inside her. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, hard-won understanding that she no longer had to shrink herself to survive in rooms full of people who wanted her gone. She had a crown now, yes, but more than that, she had a man standing beside her who had chosen, without hesitation, to defend her over the noblewoman who'd been groomed her entire life for exactly this position. It was, Alora realized later that night, the first time in her life someone had chosen her so completely and so publicly, without a single moment of doubt. In the weeks leading up to the blood moon, something changed between them that neither Alora nor Ronan had planned for or dared to name at first. It started in small moments. Ronan, who had spent 5 years refusing every offer of help, began seeking her out. Not out of necessity, but because her presence had become, without either of them quite noticing when, the only part of his day that didn't feel like survival. Alora, who had spent 19 years believing she was too plain, too poor, too unclaimed to ever be truly wanted, found herself living for the rare, unguarded moments when Ronan's tired eyes would soften just looking at her. He taught her to ride, patiently, on the mornings his legs held strong enough to walk beside the horse. She taught him, in turn, how to laugh again, genuinely, helplessly, the way he apparently hadn't in half a decade. The first time she deliberately lost a game of cards, just to watch his rare, crooked smile. "You're doing it on purpose," he accused, amused despite himself. "I have no idea what you mean, Your Grace. You just called 2 pairs a royal flush." "Did I? How embarrassing for me." He laughed, really laughed, the sound rough with disuse, and in that moment, watching firelight catch the unguarded warmth in his face, Alora understood with sudden breathless clarity that she had fallen in love with him. Not the king, not the curse or the crown or the political marriage that had brought them together. Him, the man who apologized to his guards for snapping at them during his worst nights, who still, after everything, insisted on personally checking that the kitchen staff were fed before himself. Alora. His voice had gone quiet, serious, the laughter fading into something more fragile. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She waited, heart in her throat. "I didn't want this marriage," he said. "I told myself I'd never let anyone close enough to watch what happens to me on a full moon. Never let anyone close enough to grieve me when the curse finally wins. And then you walked into that tower like you weren't afraid of anything. And every wall I built in 5 years turned to ash in about 30 seconds. He exhaled, unsteady. "I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment you didn't run." Alora felt something crack open in her chest. 19 years of believing she was unworthy of exactly this kind of love dissolving all at once. "I love you," she whispered, "and I am not going to lose you to that curse. Not after everything the moon goddess did to bring us together." He kissed her then, gently, like a man handling something he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to have. And for one suspended moment, the war, the curse, and the blood moon bearing down on them all seemed impossibly far away. In the days after they finally said the words "I love you" aloud, something in Duskmoor Castle itself seemed to soften, as though the stones had been holding their breath for 5 years and had only now been given permission to exhale. Alora moved from her cold, isolated chamber in the eastern wing into Ronan's rooms in the central keep. Not because propriety demanded it, but because neither of them could stand another night sleeping apart, aching with the particular loneliness of two people who had finally found the one thing they'd both been missing and refused to waste a single hour pretending otherwise. She learned him slowly, the way you learn a landscape by walking it, not all at once, but in accumulating detail. She learned he hummed old lullabies under his breath when he thought no one could hear, fragments of a song his mother used to sing before the plague took her when he was 12. She learned he still, after everything, apologized quietly to his own reflection some mornings, as though some small wounded part of him hadn't yet caught up to the fact that he was allowed to be loved exactly as he was, curse and all. She learned, too, the particular terror that lived behind his eyes in the days leading up to a full moon. Not fear of the transformation itself anymore, not entirely, but fear that one night his control might slip far enough to hurt her, the one person he could not bear to lose. "You won't hurt me," she told him the night before the moon rose thin and waxing over the mountains. "I've looked that beast in the eye, Ronan. I wasn't afraid of him. I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," he said, though his hand tightened around hers as he said it, betraying how badly he wanted her to be right. "Everyone who's ever loved someone like me has had a reason to be afraid." "Then I suppose," Alora said, pressing a kiss to the scarred line along his jaw, "I'll simply have to be the first exception." For his part, Ronan taught her things, too, small kindnesses she'd never ever given the chance to receive. He taught her to read the star charts his grandfather had kept, patiently correcting her when she mixed up constellations, laughing softly at her stubborn insistence that one particular cluster of stars looked more like a lopsided rabbit than the hunter's bow it was named for. He had the castle seamstresses design gowns that were entirely, deliberately hers, not borrowed, not altered from someone else's cast-offs, but made new in the deep blue and silver of the Duskmoor sigil, stitched with the same crescent moon pattern as the mark on her wrist. "I don't need gowns to know I belong here," she told him, though her voice caught at the gesture. "I know," he said. "I wanted you to have them anyway. You spent your whole life wearing what other people decided was good enough for you. I wanted, just once, for something to be made entirely for you and no one else. It was such a small thing in the shadow of curses and wars and ancient prophecies. It was, Alora thought, one of the largest things anyone had ever given her. They did not know, in those tender, stolen weeks, that the Blood Moon Ironclaw's forces had been waiting for was only days away. That every gentle moment they were building together was, in truth, a foundation being laid just in time to withstand the storm that was coming for both of them. The 3 days before the blood moon passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Isolde marshaled the Black Pine Guard along the outer walls, doubling patrols and stockpiling silver-forged weapons in every armory the castle possessed. Corbin barricaded himself in the archive tower, cross-referencing every fragment of Silvermoon ritual text he could find, terrified of sending Alora into the binding ceremony with incomplete knowledge. Ronan, growing visibly more exhausted as the crimson moon approached, spent his remaining strength drilling defensive formations with a grim, focused intensity that reminded the older guards of the king he had been before the curse first took hold of him. Alora spent those same 3 days memorizing the binding ritual until the words lived in her bones. Until she could have spoken them in her sleep. In a burning building, with a blade at her throat. She did not know, not truly, whether the ritual would work. Corvin's texts were incomplete, damaged by centuries in fire, and the deliberate destruction of Silvermoon knowledge by enemies who'd feared it for generations. But she knew with a certainty deeper than fear that she would try until her body gave out. Because the alternative, losing Ronan to the very curse that had first brought them together, was not a future she could allow herself to imagine. "If it doesn't work," Ronan said quietly the night before the moon rose, "I need you to run. Take Isolde. Take Corvin. Take whoever will listen to you and get as far from this castle as you can." "It's going to work," Alora said. "Alora. It's going to work," she repeated more fiercely, "because I refuse to let it end any other way. Do you understand me? I did not survive 19 years of being told I was nothing just to lose the first person who ever made me feel like everything to a curse some jealous, small-minded alpha decided to inflict out of spite. We are going to win this, both parts of it, the war and the man." He kissed her then, hard and desperate and grateful, and neither of them spoke of running again. The attack came exactly as the captured general had warned, under the crimson light of the blood moon, when Ironclaw's forces believed Ronan would be at his weakest. Malric Ironclaw's army struck the outer walls just past midnight, catapults hurling burning pitch over the ramparts. Wave after wave of Ironclaw's Lycan soldiers scaling the black stone with a coordinated ferocity that spoke of years of planning. Isolde met the first breach herself, blade flashing silver in the crimson light, rallying the Black Pine Guard with a battle cry that echoed off the mountains. Inside the great hall, exactly as the blood moon reached its zenith, Ronan's curse surged with a violence unlike anything Alora had witnessed before. They had never accounted for Alora. As enemy forces breached the outer walls, Ronan's curse surged violently under the blood moon's power, tearing through his control faster and more brutally than any full moon before it. Alora watched in horror as he collapsed in the great hall, his body racked with the same violent transformation she'd witnessed months earlier, except this time, the Lycan spirit clawing for dominance was stronger, angrier, sensing perhaps that this was its final chance to consume him completely. "Kill it before it turns," one of the panicked younger guards shouted, raising his blade toward the transforming king. "No!" Alora stepped directly between the blade and Ronan's convulsing body, Silvermoon energy flaring instinctively from the crescent mark on her wrist, bright as captured moonlight. "I won't let you hurt him." She had never performed the ritual Corvin described. She had only read about it in fragments, in genealogical charts written for priestesses who'd trained their entire lives for this exact moment. She had none of that training. She had only love and terror, and a certainty that had carried her through every impossible moment of her life until now. She pressed both hands against Ronan's chest as the Lycan form fully emerged, silver light pouring from her mark into his shuddering body, and spoke the words Corvin had taught her. Ancient, half-forgotten words that felt less like language and more like intention given voice. "I bind not to control, but to release. I claim not to own, but to love. Moon to moon, blood to blood, I call back the soul this curse has tried to steal." The Lycan roared, an agonized splitting sound that shook the castle's ancient stones as 5 years of bound malevolent spirit fought against the pull of the ritual with everything it had left. Alora held on, silver light blazing brighter, her own strength pouring into the bond until her vision swam and her knees buckled. And still, she did not let go. "I choose you," she gasped, blood trickling from her nose with the effort. "Broken or whole, cursed or free, I choose you. Ronan Duskmore, come back to me." The Lycan's massive form convulsed one final time, And then, in a burst of silver light that drove Ironclaw's invading forces back in terror, the curse shattered entirely. A physical, visible rupture, like glass breaking apart in midair, and Ronan Duskmore collapsed back into his human form, breathing, whole, and entirely, finally, free. While Alora knelt over Ronan's restored body in the great hall, the battle outside the castle walls had reached its own breaking point, and Isolde had held the eastern breach for nearly an hour against overwhelming numbers, her silver blade running red. 3 of her best guards fallen beside her, when the burst of blinding silver light tore across the night sky from the great hall's high windows. Visible even through the chaos of burning pitch and clashing steel, every Lycan soldier on the battlefield, friend and enemy alike, froze at the sight of it. Some ancient instinct in their wolf blood, recognizing raw Silvermoon power for exactly what it was. Malric Ironclaw, watching from the rear lines where cowardice had kept him safely removed from the actual fighting, felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood, with dawning horror, exactly what that light meant. "That's not possible," he snarled to his lieutenant. "The Silvermoon bloodline died out generations ago." "Apparently not entirely, my lord." Moments later, the doors of Duskmore Castle's great hall burst open, and Ronan Duskmore emerged onto the battlements. Not weak, not crippled, not the diminished king Ironclaw's spies had spent 5 years reporting on, but the full terrible strength of an alpha, finally restored. Moonlight and fury blazing in eyes that had been dimmed by suffering for half a decade. The battle that followed lasted less than 20 minutes. Ironclaw's soldiers, already shaken by the display of Silvermoon power, and now facing a king who fought like every year of stolen strength was repainted once, broke formation within the first assault. Isolde, given the opening she'd been fighting for all night, led the countercharge that shattered what remained of Ironclaw's organized ranks. Malric himself was found at dawn attempting to flee through the eastern forest, dragged back to Duskmore Castle in chains by Isolde's own hand. "You should have stayed crippled," Malric spat, kneeling before the king he'd spent 5 years trying to destroy. "The curse was supposed to be permanent. My witch swore it would consume you completely." "Your witch," Ronan said, with the quiet, terrible calm of a man who had earned the right to be merciful and chosen not to be entirely. Clearly never accounted for the fact that love is older and stronger than any curse you could buy. "Take him to the council. Let them decide what 5 years of attempted regicide and treason are worth." As Malric was led away, still snarling curses at a fate he'd never imagined losing to, Alora emerged from the great hall, exhausted, silver light still fading from her wrist, and found Ronan's eyes already searching for hers across the battlements. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it lifted her briefly off her feet, uncaring of the watching soldiers, uncaring of anything except the fact that they had both, against every possible odds, survived. "We won," she whispered against his chest, still hardly believing it herself. "We won." He agreed and kissed her like a man who intended to spend the rest of his life proving it wasn't a fluke. With the curse broken and Ronan's full strength restored for the first time in 5 years, the tide of the battle turned within the hour. Ironclaw's forces, already shaken by the terrifying display of Silvermoon power, crumbled entirely when Ronan himself, restored, furious, and fighting for the woman who just tore a curse out of his soul with her bare hands, led the counterattack personally. Malric Ironclaw was captured before dawn. His conspiracy laid bare before the assembled Council of Pax. In the aftermath, as the sun rose fully over a castle finally at peace, Ronan knelt before Alora in front of the entire surviving court. Not as a king performing duty, but as a man overwhelmed with gratitude he had no adequate words for. "5 years ago," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "I believed I would die alone, hated and feared by everyone who ever looked at me. This woman," his voice caught, and he did not try to hide it, This woman that half this court laughed at when she arrived, walked into the one place in this castle everyone else was too afraid to enter, and she did not run. She has since bled for this kingdom, broken a curse older than any of our grandparents, and loved me back into a man I thought I'd lost forever." He rose, taking both her hands in his. "Alora Vane, born of the Silvermoon bloodline, moonbound mate of my heart, will you rule beside me? Not as a political arrangement, not as an obligation, as my equal, my queen, and the only person I have ever truly wanted." Alora, the girl once dismissed by an entire village as unworthy of any alpha's attention, looked out at the court that had once laughed at her wedding and felt nothing but the steady, unshakable warmth of a love she had never once believed she deserved, and now knew with total certainty that she did. "Yes," she said, and the word rang through the hall like a bell. "Every broken piece of me chose you the moment I heard you howling in that tower, and I would choose you again in every lifetime the moon goddess ever gives us." The court that had mocked her wedding day erupted instead into cheers, and somewhere above the castle, though no one could quite explain it, the sky cleared to reveal, for one brief and impossible moment, both the sun and the pale silver echo of the moon shining together. 3 months after the coronation, Alora made one final journey, not as a duty, but as a choice she'd needed to make on her own terms. She returned to Ash Hollow. The village looked exactly as she remembered it. Wood smoke and old rain, narrow lanes she'd once scrubbed floors along for coin that barely fed her. But this time, she did not arrive as the unclaimed girl from the tannery loft. She arrived in a carriage bearing the Duskmore sigil, escorted by Isolde's honor guard, with Ronan riding beside her at her own insistence, not because she needed his protection, but because she wanted the village that had spent 19 years telling her she was worthless to see, with their own eyes exactly who had chosen her. The same women who had once whispered cursed behind her back now curtsied so low their foreheads nearly touched the ground. The same boys who'd mocked her in the square now stood in stunned, humbled silence. Alora felt, for one brief moment, the old temptation to let herself enjoy their humiliation the way they'd once enjoyed hers. She chose differently. "I'm not here for revenge," she told the gathered village, standing in the same square where the royal riders had once found her scrubbing floors. "I'm here because this village raised me, even when it didn't want to, even when it never once made me feel like I belonged. I survived here, and because I survived here, I was ready when the moon goddess finally needed me to be." She funded a school for Ash Hollow's Omega children that day, the first of its kind in the Northern Territories, dedicated to teaching every abandoned, overlooked child in the region that a birthmark, a bloodline, or a family's absence did not determine their worth. She named it simply the Hollow Light and visited it personally every year for the rest of her life, always making time to sit with the children. Other villages had already begun to write off, the way Ash Hollow had once written her off. "You didn't have to forgive them," Ronan said quietly as their carriage pulled away from the village that had shaped her into someone strong enough to survive everything that came after. "I didn't forgive them for their sake," Alora said, watching Ash Hollow fade into the mountain fog behind them. "I forgave them for mine. I refuse to carry their cruelty with me for the rest of my life, when I finally have something so much better to carry instead." He took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way back to Duskmore Castle, in a silence that held, for the first time in either of their lives, absolutely nothing left to fear. Years later, the story of Alora Vane, the forgotten Omega, who married a cursed king and broke a curse older than the kingdom itself, would be told in every corner of the Northern Territories. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a promise that the ones the world calls worthless are so often the ones carrying the most extraordinary power, waiting only for someone brave enough past what everyone else assumed. Under Ronan and Alora's joint rule, the Duskmore pack grew into the most stable, most prosperous kingdom the Northern Wolves had known in a generation. The rival packs, witnessing the strength of a king restored and a queen born of ancient priestess blood, chose alliance over war, one by one, until the northern territories saw a peace unmatched in living memory. Isolde remained general of the Black Pine Guard for the rest of her long life, fiercely loyal, occasionally insufferable, and utterly devoted to the sister-in-law she'd once sworn to watch closely. A promise she kept in the end, not out of suspicion, but out of love. Corvin's archive tower became the founding library of a new Silvermoon Academy, where Alora's bloodline knowledge was finally, deliberately preserved rather than nearly erased, ensuring no future generation would have to rediscover their own history in fragments and desperation the way she had. The years brought children of their own. A daughter first, with her father's steady gold-flecked eyes and her mother's stubborn refusal to be underestimated. And a son 2 years later, born fittingly, on the night of a full moon so gentle and painless that the entire castle celebrated it as a holiday for a generation afterward. Alora taught both of them, from the time they could first understand words, that the family who raises you and the family who chooses you are not always the same people, and that either kind, when given freely and without condition, is worth everything. And in the quiet of their private chambers, on full moons that no longer brought pain, but simply the ordinary, precious rhythm of a life shared, Ronan would still sometimes pull Alora close and murmur, disbelieving even after everything, that he could not believe the moon goddess had chosen to save him through a girl the whole world had once thrown away. "She didn't just save you," Alora would always answer, smiling against his chest. "She knew exactly what we'd become together." Decades later, long after Malric Ironclaw's name had faded into little more than a cautionary footnote in the Northern Territory's history, and long after the last full moon Ronan Duskmore ever spent in fear, storytellers across the kingdom would still recount the tale of the forgotten Omega who had walked willingly into a locked tower. Everyone else was too afraid to enter, and had loved a cursed king back into wholeness, with nothing but her own unshakable refusal to be told ever again that she was not enough. And somewhere in the mountains above Ash Hollow, in the village that had once dismissed her as worthless, an old birthmark on a tannery girl's wrist became at last the legend it was always destined to be. Proof for every overlooked and underestimated soul who ever heard the story afterward, that the ones the world calls nothing are so often the ones the universe has been saving for something extraordinary all along. That's the story. And I hope every single one of you felt Alora and Ronan's journey as deeply as I did writing it. If you enjoyed this one, please take a moment to like the video, drop a comment telling me your favorite chapter, and subscribe to Rena Romance too, so you never miss the next full-length story. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.